G'day folks, here with Jamie McIntyre, owner and founder of Lux Property Group. How are you, Mr. Jamie?
Good, mate. It's always a pleasure to have a chat with you.
Yeah, always good to be in Indonesia, and it's been impressive to look at all things going on Lux here in Seminyak. And Jamie, we've just been discussing the current state of affairs around the world. Now, you accurately predicted the fall or the decline and then the subsequent fall of the West several years ago. We're seeing massive immigration, hyperinflation, soaring crime rates and so on. Give us your take on what's happening in the West versus what's happening in the BRICS nations at the moment and places like Indonesia.
Yeah, I guess the people that don't know my career that have followed my work for the last 25 years, we've always been able to, not just Australian National Review, but before that, the 21st century, etc., accurately predict financial future, financial predictions. Like we predicted, we told Australians to buy real estate in Australia for the last 25 years, but every 10 years. That turned out to be more than true. When people thought it was a get-rich-quick scheme, the idea you could buy property and get rich in Australia, but now it's very self-evident. That's worked very well. We told people to buy Bitcoin when no one wanted to know about it. Back in 2013, less than $100 US. We held the first Bitcoin global conference in Australia in Melbourne, 2014. Launched the ATMs with Bitcoins back then as well. So we're early into that trend as well because we believe that it was a new financial system. So we're always been good at predicting the future. We also predict the bottom of the US property market, 2010. So those who have followed our predictions have done very well. Like we estimate over 10 billion and rising rapidly, our private investor network, what they've made from following those predictions. But then about 3 or 4 years ago, Dave, I started warning the alarm bells about the Australian real estate market, the Australian economy in the West, that I'm starting to consider diversifying my portfolio, some of not leaving at all in Australia, getting some out of Australia, and looking at BRIC nations, So Indonesia is part of the BRIC Plus nations, but BRICS, was originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's now 35 different nations. These nations want a multipolar world versus the West really wants a one world type government. So I've been predicting the fall, and not just myself, the others. In my first book, What I Didn't Learn at School, but which I had, I talked about, I think chapter 5, that the Federal Reserve Bank was effectively a scam. They're printing fake money. It's not backed by any real assets. And one day people will find that out. It will lead to rampant inflation, endless wars being funded by the printing of money. And now we see that to be true. Talks of ending the Fed in recent years, and China, Russia, Indonesia just opened a gold bank. All these other nations that are smart enough going, we don't trust the US dollar anymore. It was a reserve currency since World War II, so the Bretton Woods, financial system was really, they were able to print money and buy up the world by exporting inflation. Like if Zimbabwe goes and prints money, causes rampant inflation, and you need a wheelbarrow of Zimbabwean money and it's worthless, can't even buy a loaf of bread. But America was able to do that through the bankers had control of that. But those days are up. COVID ended that. It's too much printing of money, and now you see inflation in the West. So I've always predicted that eventually people find out it's backed by nothing. And the countries are not switching to, they're trying to create a BRICS currency, but what they're really switching to is gold-backed currency, is what it's going to go to. China is buying up record gold. It just cancelled the trading of paper gold, silver as well, because all these paper assets, if you buy gold and don't have the physical gold, or that physical gold's not stored somewhere, you just have a piece of paper. Do you trust the Western banking system? That piece of paper is actually backed by gold? Do you trust when you have a US dollar or Australian dollar note that's actually backed by physical assets? Well, we shouldn't, because it's not. And that's why the Western system's going to collapse. They've used it to sanction Russia, sanction Iran, sanction other nations, and that was the end of it. So now there's the alternative to SWIFT, there's an alternative financial system growing outside the West. So I believe the West will collapse. Russia, China, BRIC nations will be affected by that, but I don't think they will collapse because they're already operating outside the Western banking system.
And I think if you look at what's happening in Western nations, we're seeing it's not economic mismanagement. None of this is accidental, none of it's incompetence. It's all a controlled demolition. It's meticulously well planned. Flood the place with enormous amounts of immigrants who are impoverished, who need loads of welfare, push up the cost of living, raise interest rates. Now you have foreclosures on homes. You've got this complete controlled demolition and an overall sense that the governments of the West are trying to destroy its own people. Just look at what's happening in Spain right now. 30,000 immigrants are just flying in all the sweating in and climb fences, barbed wire, all sorts of crazy things. And we're seeing woke leftist Western nations completely fall to pieces. And the difference that you sense here is that the government is not trying to destroy its own people.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point there. The difference is you got either left-wing governments, which is the woke Davos crowd, you'll own nothing but be happy 2030 agenda, which would scare the bejesus out of any Australian if you think private ownership. Of course, they can't just introduce communism and say no more private ownership in Australia or the West, because you would revolt. You'd actually go out in the streets and do something about it. But what they can do is slow creeping communism, which is globalism is slow creeping communism. How would they do that? Which we told people they would do, and which is now done. They'd slowly increase taxes, in particular property taxes, etc. So eventually people won't be able to afford to keep their property. That's how they take it off the floor. And then, of course, BlackRock, these other large organizations will come in and swoop up all the assets. So, yes, the government's almost as if they're doing it deliberately. They're following an agenda. It's not coincidental that the same thing in Western Europe is also happening here and around the world. It is a coordinated plan. And if you study history and study the financial cycles, the Great Depression, if you study that, you realize that was no accident. That was engineered. And whenever people start to awaken too much to those elites that are trying to control the world, they usually engineer another world war. You've seen in the 30s, people started to wake up. And then, of course, they engineered World War II, financial crisis, etc. But since then, we lived in Australia. We grew up in good times, right, after World War II, and lived in a peaceful bubble, a prosperous nation like Australia. So we had it good. We don't realize how good we had it, but that's not reality. And Australia hasn't managed its wealth. It sells its commodities. It's a globalized nation. It doesn't have a nationalist leader. It has either left-wing woke leaders or right faction leaders, without getting into politics too much. So, in other words, you don't have a nationalist leader. But look at China. You can't argue. China is not a globalist puppet running China. The president of China is a nationalist leader. What about Russia? Nationalist leader. What about Indonesia? Mightn't be perfect, but nationalist leaders.
Yeah, I think most Australians were horrified to see the Indian president welcome to a stadium packed full of Indians. And not that there's a problem with Indians. There is just a problem when you have far too many people coming into a country than that country can cope. We already have an extraordinary shortage of housing in the country, in Australia. But now you've got a system whereby people are finding it harder and harder to get money out of the banks or potentially get money out of the country. And I wanted you to speak into that a bit, Jamie, because a lot of people have reached out to me and said, hey, Dave, are you relocating into Indonesia? What's your plan? I'm worried about Australia. Talk to me about capital controls. Do you see a time in the future whereby Australian banks may make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to move funding or assets offshore?
Yeah, I think you have to take it serious. Political risk. The political risk, people say, what about the political risk of investing in a country like Indonesia, as an example? And I say, what about the political risk of keeping all your assets in a country like Australia that has the globalist elite? It's not a conspiracy anymore, the 2030 agenda. You'll own nothing but be happy. We should perhaps listen to what they're saying. So you have problems in Australia. So